The rain hadn't stopped all day. It started as a soft patter on the windows when I arrived at the office that morning, but by evening it was coming down in sheets, turning the streets into gleaming rivers of reflected light. My last client had canceled. I wasn't surprised. Most people didn't like driving in weather like this, and I didn't blame them. Hell, I didn't want to be here either. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the client notes scattered across my desk. The dim glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room, softening the edges of the bookshelves and the worn couch in the corner. Everything about the space was designed to feel safe, inviting. But lately, I'd felt like a stranger here. I picked up my cold coffee, took a sip, and grimaced. The bitterness was sharp, but it kept my mind from wandering too far. My work was supposed to keep me grounded, but lately, it felt like I was floating just above everything, detached. I told myself it was just stress. Too many sessions, too many stories, and not enough time to unpack them. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. It had been 2 years since the divorce. Some days it felt longer, others like it had just happened. I didn't miss the fights, the shouting matches that left our daughter hiding in her room, or the way the house had reeked of stale whiskey by noon. Alcoholism wasn't something to be taken lightly, and it had taken me too long to see it for what it was, a problem I couldn't fix. David used to be a good man. At least, I thought so. But the man I'd married wasn't the same one I left. He'd let the bottle take over, and no amount of promises or therapy sessions could change that. The hardest part wasn't walking away. It was walking away with my daughter in tow, knowing she'd carry the weight of it long after I'd packed our bags. Since then, it had just been the two of us. I worked long hours, trying to keep the lights on and the fridge full, while she did her best to make sense of a world that didn't make sense anymore. She said she was fine, and I believed her, most days. But when the house got too quiet, I couldn't help wondering if I'd done enough, if leaving had been enough. I glanced at the clock. 6:45 p.m. A time that should have felt ordinary, but tonight, it didn't. The rain outside seemed louder, the world more distant. I told myself I'd pack up soon, go home, pour a drink, and pretend for a few hours that everything was fine. The phone rang. "Dr. Monroe," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause on the other end, just static, faint and crackling, like a bad connection. I almost hung up when I heard it. A man's voice, quiet and trembling. "My name is Thomas Gallagher. You're the therapist," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," I replied, leaning forward. "How can I help you?" I need to talk to someone tonight." "Tonight?" I glanced at the clock again, frowning. I don't usually take last-minute sessions. My schedule... "Please," he interrupted. The desperation in his voice stopped me cold. "I just need someone to listen. I chose you because you'll understand." I blinked. Understand what? There was another pause, heavier this time. "You felt it too, haven't you?" My stomach tightened. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You will," he whispered. The line clicked, and he was gone. I stared at the screen, and for a moment, I couldn't move. His words hung in the air like smoke, coiling into places I didn't want them to go. I should have said no. I should have told him to call back during normal hours, but something about his voice wouldn't let me. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. One session. That's all it was. I needed air. I stepped to the window, pulling my pack of cigarettes from the desk drawer. Lighting one, I exhaled a thin stream of smoke and watched the rain blur the world outside. The street was still busy despite the weather, cars splashing through puddles, people hurrying past with their collars up and their heads down. That's when I saw him. He stood across the street, motionless, a dark silhouette against the pale glow of the streetlights. While the crowd moved around him, he stayed still, his face turned up toward my window. Even from this distance, I could feel his gaze. Cold, unflinching. It sent a shiver crawling down my spine. I blinked, tearing my eyes away as my phone buzzed in my pocket. Pulling it out, I saw a text from my daughter. "Mom, when are you coming home tonight?" The message broke the moment, grounding me. I typed a quick reply. "Not late, sweetheart. Promise." Before slipping the phone back into my pocket, I looked back toward the street. He was gone. The crowd still moved, the rain still fell, but the man had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the uneasy weight in my chest. I crushed the cigarette in the ashtray and turned back to my desk. The clock read 7:01, one session, then I was going home. The rain hadn't let up. By the time the knock came at my office door, it had turned into a relentless drumming, muffling the city's usual evening noise. I checked the clock, 7:32 p.m. My last appointment of the day, though I already regretted taking it. Something about the call earlier still didn't sit right with me, like the voice on the other end had been holding something back. I stood and opened the door. The man standing there looked worse than I expected. Soaking wet, his coat clung to his wiry frame, water pooling at his feet. His face was pale, hollow, like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. His eyes darted past me, scanning the office like he was expecting to see someone else inside. "You're late," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He didn't move right away, just lingered in the doorway, staring down the hall like something was chasing him. Finally, he stepped in, his boots squeaking against the floor. "Sorry," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I motioned to the chair across from my desk. "You can hang your coat on the rack. Take a seat." He didn't. Instead, he paced a small circle near the door, his wet boots squeaking with every step. His hands were shaking, and he kept glancing at the clock on the wall. I leaned against the desk, crossing my arms, and waited. In my line of work, you learn to let people find their footing before you push them. But he didn't settle. His pacing grew faster, more erratic, and then he blurted out, "I can't talk unless you agree." "Agree to what?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. He reminded me of a cornered animal, ready to bolt at the slightest noise. "The rules," he said, finally stopping. He turned to face me, but his eyes didn't stay on mine for long. They flicked to the clock, the door, the windows, anywhere but me. "You have to follow them, or I can't do this." I straightened up, curiosity prickling at the back of my mind. "What kind of rules are we talking about?" He pulled a chair closer, sitting at the edge like he was ready to spring up again. His wet coat dripped onto the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. "You have to follow them exactly. If you don't..." He trailed off, staring at his hands. "It'll know." I frowned. "What will know?" "I don't have time to explain," he snapped, his voice rising, then quieter. "Just listen, please." I wanted to press him, to ask what he meant, but there was something in his voice that stopped me. Fear. The kind of fear that comes from believing something terrible is already in motion. I nodded, gesturing for him to go on. "They're simple," he said, his voice trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes darting to my face and away again. "Don't look at me for longer than 20 seconds. That gave me pause. "Why 20 seconds? "Just don't do it," he said sharply, like a reprimand. "And keep the clock in your line of sight at all times. You have one, so use it." I glanced at the clock on the wall, a cheap analog thing I'd picked up at a flea market. It ticked away steadily, its hands moving like it had no idea the tension in the room. "All right," I said slowly. "What else?" "If I pause mid-sentence, do not speak until I speak again," he continued. "No questions, no interruptions." I nodded, mentally noting how unnatural that rule felt. "Anything else?" "Don't call me by my name, not during this session." I leaned back against the desk again, arms crossed. "Not even if it's relevant to the conversation?" His jaw tightened, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "Especially not then." "All right," I said, my skepticism creeping into my tone. "Any other rules I should know about?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the window. The rain was still hammering against the glass, streaking it with uneven patterns. "If I close my eyes," he said, his voice barely audible, "don't make a sound." This time, I couldn't stop the question. "Why?" His head snapped toward me, and for the first time, his eyes locked onto mine. They were wide, bloodshot, and full of something I couldn't quite name. "Because it's watching," he said, "and if you make a sound, it'll know you're here too." A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Like he believed every word with the kind of conviction you can't fake. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral. "Understood," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I'll follow your rules. Let's start." He relaxed a fraction, sinking back into the chair. For a moment, I thought he might actually settle down, but the tension never fully left his body. His hands gripped the armrests like they were the only things keeping him tethered to reality. "I don't know where to start," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't even know if I can." I waited, giving him space to continue. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then started to speak. But his words came in fragments, like he was piecing together a puzzle in his mind. "It started 3 weeks ago," he said. "I thought it was just a feeling. You know, like when someone's watching you. But it got worse. I started hearing it, seeing it. And then the rules started appearing." "Appearing where?" I asked before I could stop myself. He froze. His hands tightened on the armrests, and his breathing quickened. "Don't," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "Don't do that again." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay silent. The room felt heavier now, like the air had thickened. After a long pause, he continued. "I tried to ignore it at first, but ignoring it made it worse. That's when I realized the rules weren't just for me. They were for it, to keep it from..." He stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open like the words had been stolen. I didn't speak, remembering his earlier warning. The silence stretched on, heavy and unnatural, until he finally took a shuddering breath and finished. "To keep it from coming closer." I wanted to ask what he meant, what he thought it was, why the rules existed, but his earlier reaction kept me silent. Finally, he looked at me, though it felt more like he was looking through me. "You don't believe me." The accusation was sharp, but I kept my expression neutral. "I didn't say that." "You don't have to." His voice was low, almost resigned. He ran a hand through his damp hair, leaving it sticking up in uneven spikes. "No one ever does, not until it's too late." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Then help me understand. You said the rules appeared. What does that mean?" "In my head, on paper, scribbled on the backs of receipts I don't remember writing. Everywhere I turned, they were there, like it was trying to warn others that talked to me." "It," I echoed, my voice calm but deliberate. What is it? He flinched. His hands tightened on the chair again, and his jaw worked as though he was chewing over a confession he didn't want to make. Forget I said that, he muttered. Forget I said anything. That's not how this works, I said, my tone soft but firm. You came to me. You said you needed help. Let me help you. His gaze snapped to mine, a flicker of something wild in his bloodshot eyes. You can't help me, he hissed. No one can. The only thing you can do is follow the rules and hope it doesn't notice you. Notice me, Mr. Thomas? The question slipped out before I could stop it. His head jerked back like I'd slapped him. The air between us thickened, and the faint hum of the overhead light seemed louder all of a sudden. He stared at me, unblinking, and his breathing grew ragged. You said my name, he whispered, his voice trembling. You weren't supposed to do that. The realization hit me like a gut punch. I broke the rule. The tension in the room shifted, sharp and electric, like the moments before a storm breaks. It knows, he whispered, his voice a mix of anger and fear. It knows you're here now. Then he stood abruptly, almost knocking the chair over. His movements were jerky, frantic, like a puppet yanked on invisible strings. I shouldn't have come, he muttered. I shouldn't have brought it here. Wait, I said, rising from my seat. You're not making sense. Sit down and let's talk. No. He backed toward the door, his hand scrabbling for the handle like it was his only lifeline. It's too late. You don't understand. Once it knows you, it doesn't stop. Before I could stop him, he wrenched the door open and bolted into the hallway. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, disappearing into the building's ambient hum. I stared at the open doorway, my pulse pounding in my ears. My first instinct was to follow him, to stop him from leaving in the state he was in. But something held me back. A heavy, invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I closed the door instead, locking it with a soft click. I exhaled, long and slow, trying to shake the feeling crawling under my skin. I'd dealt with difficult clients before, paranoid, delusional, sometimes dangerous, but this felt different. His fear wasn't just fear, it was certainty. The drive home felt longer than usual. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers didn't calm me the way it usually did. My mind kept circling back to the session, the client's trembling voice, his wide, bloodshot eyes, the rules I hadn't fully followed. It was nonsense. It had to be. But the thought clung to me like damp clothes, impossible to shake. When I stepped into the house, the air felt colder than it should have. My daughter Lily was curled up on the couch with a blanket, her eyes glued to the television. She looked up as I set my bag down by the door. Why the long face? She asked. Sorry, sweetheart. Long day, I replied, forcing a smile. Did you eat? She nodded. Leftovers. I saved you some. Thanks, kiddo, I said, ruffling her hair as I passed. It wasn't until later, after Lily had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, that I felt it again. That wrongness. It was hard to describe, like a faint pressure at the back of my mind. A weight that didn't belong. I tried to ignore it, busying myself with washing dishes and tidying up the living room. By midnight, I gave up on pretending everything was fine. I locked all the doors, checked the windows, and made my way to bed. The scream woke me at 2:13 a.m., high-pitched, terrified, and coming from Lily's room. My heart stopped for a moment before adrenaline kicked in, and I bolted down the hall, nearly tripping over the rug. I pushed open her door, my pulse pounding in my ears. Lily, what is it? She was sitting upright in bed, her small body trembling under the blanket. Tears streaked her face, and she pointed a shaking finger toward the closet. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "There's something in the closet." I followed her gaze. The closet door was ajar, the darkness inside impossibly deep. For a moment, I thought I could feel it too, that sense of being watched, of something waiting just out of sight. But I couldn't let her see my fear. "It's nothing, sweetie," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. I walked to the closet, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder as I reached for the door. My fingers brushed the edge of it, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. I slammed the door shut and twisted the lock. "See?" I said, turning back to Lily. "Nothing to worry about." But she didn't look convinced. Her wide eyes stayed fixed on the closet door, her small hands clutching the blanket. I climbed into bed beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's just your imagination," I whispered, stroking her hair. "You're safe. I'm here." She didn't say anything, but eventually her trembling subsided and her breathing slowed. I stayed with her until she fell asleep, her small body warm against mine. But I didn't sleep. I eased out of her bed, careful not to wake her, and padded quietly down the stairs. The house felt too still, the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for sounds that aren't there. I told myself I was just tired. Stress does that to people. The kitchen light hummed softly as I flicked it on, illuminating the stainless steel appliances and the mess of half-finished schoolwork on the counter. I opened the fridge, staring blankly at the shelves before pulling out a leftover container of lasagna. I wasn't hungry, not really, but my body craved some semblance of normalcy. Heating the food, setting the table, turning on the TV, it was all routine, a way to drown out the nagging thoughts that clawed at the edges of my mind. The local news anchor's voice filled the room as I sat down. Something about a school board meeting, a charity event downtown, and a robbery in the next neighborhood over. I barely registered the words as I picked at the lasagna, pushing it around the plate more than eating it.
In other news, police have identified the body found earlier this evening in an alley on West 23rd Street.
My fork froze midair.
Authorities have confirmed the victim as 34-year-old Thomas Gallagher.
The sound cut out, replaced by a low ringing in my ears. The image on the screen showed a grainy photo of a man, his face pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed haunted, even in a still frame. My client.
The body was found under unusual circumstances, though officials have yet to comment on the exact cause of death. Sources say the body was discovered in an advanced state of rigor mortis.
I turned the volume down, unable to listen anymore. My chest tightened, and I struggled to take a full breath. He was dead. My terrified, paranoid client was gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was my fault. The rest of the night was a blur. I sat at the kitchen table long after my food had gone cold, the dim light above casting long shadows across the room. The days that followed felt off in ways I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't one big thing. It was a series of small, subtle disturbances that wormed their way under my skin. Shadows in the corners of rooms felt deeper than they should. My reflection in the bathroom mirror lingered half a second too long when I turned away. And then there was Lily. I woke up one night to find her standing in the living room, facing the front door. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Her small figure was unnervingly still, her arms hanging limp at her sides. "Lily," I called, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sweetheart, what are you doing out of bed?" When I reached her, I touched her shoulder gently. and she turned toward me. Her eyes, normally bright and full of life, were pale, unfocused. For a moment, it was like she wasn't there at all. "Lily!" I shook her, harder than I meant to, and just like that, she blinked. Her eyes cleared, and her small hand reached up to rub them. "Mommy," she murmured sleepily. I knelt down, pulling her into a tight hug. "It's okay, baby. You were just sleepwalking. Let's get you back to bed." She let me guide her upstairs without protest, but the knot in my stomach didn't ease. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by her bed with the lights on, my gaze flicking between the closet and the clock on the wall. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I opened my laptop, searching for Thomas Gallagher's name. The news articles about his death were vague. Unusual circumstances, no signs of foul play, but I managed to find an obituary listing. It included an address, a small house on the outskirts of the city. I drove there that afternoon. The house was modest, with peeling paint and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. An older woman answered the door, her eyes red and tired. "Mrs. Gallagher?" I asked, my voice soft. I was your son's therapist." Her expression tightened, but she nodded and stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, unsure of what else to offer. "I know this is a difficult time, but I was hoping I could see his room. There might be something there that could help me understand what happened." She hesitated, studying me with a mixture of suspicion and grief. "It's upstairs, first door on the right." I climbed the narrow staircase, each creak of the wood feeling like a warning. His room was small, cluttered, and filled with books stacked haphazardly on every surface. On the desk, half hidden beneath a pile of loose papers, I found a worn leather journal. I picked it up, the weight of it heavier than I expected, and flipped to the first page. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, like it had been scrawled in haste. Words overlapped in places, scratched out in others, as if the writer's thoughts had been too fast for his hand to keep up. March 3rd. It started with the shadow. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. A flicker at the edge of my vision, gone before I could look directly at it. But then it happened again and again. Always there, just out of reach. A chill ran down my spine as I scanned the next few entries. They detailed Thomas's growing paranoia. Whispers in the night. Objects moving on their own. Time slipping away in fragments he couldn't account for. It sounded insane, like the ramblings of someone losing their grip on reality. But then I turned the page, and the words stopped me cold. March 18th. I think it feeds on fear, on guilt, on the cracks in your mind where the light doesn't reach. I've tried everything. Prayers, rituals, even trying to face it head on, but it doesn't care. The words grew more frantic, the handwriting devolving into a near indecipherable scrawl. Pages were filled with fragmented sentences, symbols I didn't recognize, and desperate pleas scratched so deep into the paper that they tore through. And then I reached the final entry, March 23rd. It wants something, a part of me, something important. That's the only way to sever the connection. But I'm afraid. God, I'm so afraid. What if it's not enough? What if I give it everything and it still won't leave? The page ended there, a jagged line cutting across the paper as if the pen had slipped from his hand. I stared at it, the weight of those unfinished words sinking into me like a stone in deep water. My thoughts churned, pulling at loose threads, trying to weave together the fragments of the past week. Things I'd seen, things I'd heard, things I wished I hadn't. I thought of Lily, standing in the dark with those pale, unseeing eyes. The way her voice trembled when she asked why the closet made noises at night. This wasn't just about me anymore. I closed the journal and tucked it under my arm, heading back downstairs. Mrs. Gallagher was in the kitchen, clutching a mug of tea in hands that shook more than mine. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Maybe," I said, though the words felt wrong in my mouth. "Thank you for letting me look." She nodded but didn't meet my eyes. As I turned to leave, her voice stopped me in my tracks. "He told me, you know," she said. Before it took him, he said if you see it once, you'll see it forever." I stiffened, my fingers digging into the journal's worn cover. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice threading through the silence, barely there. She looked at me then, her eyes bloodshot and filled with a fear I recognized too well. "You know exactly what I mean." The drive home was a blur, my thoughts spiraling as the rain streaked across the windshield. The journal sat heavy on the passenger seat, its presence a constant reminder of what I couldn't ignore any longer. If the rules were the only thing keeping it at bay, then breaking them meant I'd invited it in. And if Thomas was right, if the entity wanted something important, then I already knew what I had to do. My office, my career. It wasn't just a job. It was everything I'd built. The office had been my salvation, the one place where I felt like I could still make a difference. Every life I helped, every breakthrough I witnessed, reminded me why I'd chosen this path in the first place. And I wasn't done. I had plans, dreams for what I could build next. Workshops for parents struggling to connect with their kids. Support groups for those living with grief. There were still so many lives I wanted to touch, so many stories I wanted to be part of. I leaned back, running a hand through my hair. To burn it down and quit wouldn't just mean losing a space. It would mean losing years of work, of progress, of purpose. But I'd broken the rules. I thought of Thomas, of the wild, desperate look in his eyes, the fear that had followed him into my office. I'd written him off as paranoid, delusional, but now I understood. When I broke the rules, I hadn't just invited the entity into my office. I'd invited it into my life. And then there was Lily. Her laughter in the living room, the way she clung to me after bad dreams, the faint screams that still echoed in my mind from the night I found her standing in the dark. She needed me. It was a trade, one I didn't want to make, but one I couldn't avoid. My office and my career wasn't just a part of me, it was me, the life I'd built when I had nothing left. And now, I was going to destroy it. I didn't know if this would work, but I couldn't wait to find out. The shadows were growing bolder, and Lily's pale, unseeing eyes haunted me every time I closed mine. The office was dark when I stepped inside for the last time. The air was heavy, and the faint scent of stale coffee clung to the walls. Everything looked as it always did. The desk piled with papers. The couch where so many had unburdened themselves. The clock ticking steadily in the corner. I moved through the office. The space heater clicked softly as I turned it to its highest setting. I piled old papers and loose folders around it, careful to arrange them in a way that looked accidental. A wastebasket stuffed with crumpled pages sat just beneath the vent, a single spark away from igniting. My fingers brushed over a framed photo of Lily and me, taken last Christmas. She was smiling wide, her cheeks flushed from the cold. I pulled it from the wall, hesitating for a moment before setting it aside. This was one thing I wouldn't leave behind. The heater began to hum louder, the metal casing radiating heat. I grabbed my bag, slinging it over my shoulder as I took one last look around. The space I'd built, the life I'd poured into it, It was all about to go up in flames. I stepped into the hallway, closing the office door softly behind me. The heater would do its job soon enough, the flames spreading quietly until there was nothing left. I watched from across the street as the fire department doused the smoldering remains of the building. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying with it the ashes of my career, my sanctuary, my identity. The next few days were uneventful, almost unnervingly so. No shadows, no whispers. The clock on the wall ticked in perfect rhythm, its sound no longer grating but steady and comforting. I changed my number and started looking for other jobs. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. It wasn't until a week later that I noticed it. Lily was drawing in the living room, her crayons scattered across the coffee table. I glanced over her shoulder, smiling as I watched her work. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" I asked. She held up the paper, a proud grin on her face. My blood turned to ice. The picture was simple, childish, with crude lines and uneven colors, but there was no mistaking it. A dark figure loomed in the background, its shadowy form stretching unnaturally across the page. "Who's this?" I asked, my voice catching. Her smile faltered. "The man from the closet."